Hey everyone, I wanted to jump in here before this episode begins and fill you in on what you are about to hear. This episode has been a labor of love for me. In just a moment, you will be meeting my dad, Dan Hladky, who in about a month from right now will be retiring after 48 years as a CAA. When I was thinking about how I wanted to honor him, I knew I wanted to memorialize the impact of his career and his life on the many students, faculty, and staff he has met over the years. Hearing how our life has rippled out far and wide from us is a privilege that most of us will only experience after we are gone. I had asked my dad if I could do a process interview with him to discuss the beginnings of the CAA profession and what it felt like to give anesthesia back then as a CAA. He did not know about anything else you will hear. I am honored to be a part of telling my dad in the here and now how big his impact truly has been, how many lives he has touched, and how greatly he will be missed by his CAA community. I hope this episode reminds you that every interaction you have as a CAA could be a life-changing moment for someone and that you matter greatly. Throughout this episode, you will hear messages from people across the country remembering my dad, and any voices that you don't know are his children or grandchildren I asked to be voice actors. It is my great honor to share this episode with you all. Love you, Dad, and congrats. Welcome to the Awakened Anesthetist podcast. I'm your host, Mary Roberts. I'm a Certified Anesthesiologist Assistant living and working outside of Kansas City, Missouri. I created this podcast to give CAAs across the nation a place to come together and awaken to our profession's unique ability to create a life by design rather than default. That process can start by simply listening and engaging with this podcast. By doing so, you're already changing what's possible for CAAs, for you, for me, for all of us. I'm so thankful you're here. Let's jump into this episode and see what we can do together. Hello, all my fellow CAAs, CAA students, and anesthetist colleagues. I am your host, Mary Jean, and welcome to our process series. These process episodes are meant to expand our collective understanding of what a CAA can be and do, and move us all in the direction of creating our own life by design rather than default. I am so excited to get to create them for us because these episodes are a direct overlap of two things I love: the power of my CAA profession to create a life by design, and storytelling. Our guest today is a CAA who I can promise is a good storyteller himself and instilled in me my deep love for listening to a good story. So let's start this interview, like all things medical, with a quick timeout to introduce our guest. Dan Hladky graduated from the second class of CAAs ever out of Case Western Reserve University in 1974. In December of 2022, he will retire after 48 years of teaching and working as a CAA. Dan lives in Kansas City, Missouri with his wife, also named Mary, and Dan and Mary happen to be my parents. This episode will expand any CAAs who are curious about the beginnings of our profession, anyone who is thinking about taking a risk in their career or making a big shift, and anyone who wants to be reminded that their one life creates ripples far beyond them. Welcome, Dad, to the Awakened Anesthetist.
Well, thank you, Mary. You certainly communicate much better than you did when you were 2 years old. So
our guest today does happen to be my dad, and he is the longest career CAA that I know, and I am assuming that most of us who are listening will be able to say the same thing. So before he retires, I just really wanted to get on record all of his memories and what it felt like to be one of the first few CAAs. So I hope this episode is really interesting and expansive to all of us who are very likely years and years away from retirement. So the first question, Dad, that I ask everyone here is, tell us about your cultural background and your upbringing.
Well, I was born in 1952, and I was the first child born to my mother and father. They eventually had 6 children. Education was very important in our family, but unfortunately, my parents didn't have a very much of an education. Neither of them finished high school. They were interrupted somewhat by the tail end of World War II. My mother was in the USO, and when the war ended, she went to Japan and entertained the troops there. And my father, who was probably a little too young for the war itself, actually got into the Coast Guard after the war and went to some of the islands to look for prisoners and things like that. Neither of them, as I mentioned, finished high school, though they were lifelong learners themselves. My father eventually got after a career in construction as a carpenter, he got into civil administration, went back to college when he was in his 40s, maybe even 50s, and got an education in business planning and management. My mother was also a informal lifelong learner who, during the Watergate era, decided she wanted to become a court reporter. So somewhere in our family history, somewhere in some closet somewhere, we've got a complete transcript of the Watergate hearings that she took on her court reporting stenographer pad. And she did that for a while. They died relatively early. My mother was 54. My dad was just 60. So they didn't never had a chance to, of course, see you as a child. And I always was saddened by that. I think they would have enjoyed playing with their grandchildren.
Mm-hmm. How did it come to be that you went to college? If they didn't go to college, how did it, did they encourage you, or that was just the natural path?
Well, it was a little bit convoluted in that my dad wanted me to go to college to play football. And it wasn't to get an education. He wanted me to play football. And I was a pretty good football player. And I did get a couple scholarship offers. And then I actually had an interview with Ohio State. And though I knew that I was not good enough for them, they talked to me.
Mm-hmm.
I asked them, so how do you see me fitting into the program? And basically, the short answer was that when I was a senior, if I really worked out well, I'd see some playing time. Other than that, I was pretty much going to sit on the bench. I was a practice dummy. Then I went to Case Western Reserve. And I interviewed with their coach, and he said, well, you're going to start as a freshman. And I said, well, offense or defense? And he goes, well, of course, both. So that's what I did. I went to Case Western Reserve with no intention of a major or, anesthesia, none of that, just to go there to play football. And I did. I was in a huddle during practice, and one of the other players mentioned that he was in the operating room and he was learning anesthesia. And I was a freshman. He was a sophomore. And wasn't exactly sure what he was talking about, but I talked to him later, and he told me about the brand new AA program that had been started at Case just the year before. He was in the first class. And I immediately went and talked with my advisor and then the head of the program, and I knew that's what I wanted to try to do.
And what year was that?
That was 1971.
Okay. Who was the person that you were talking to in the huddle?
Okay, his name was Greg Barron. He graduated as an AA. It was an undergraduate program at that point. He then applied and was accepted to medical school, and he eventually became a pediatrician.
Was that what the program was initially staged as, like a step into medical school if you get this undergraduate degree first, or what did you think you were getting yourself into?
Well, both the two programs started simultaneously at Emory University at a graduate level and Case Western Reserve as an undergraduate level. And the reason my understanding is that we chose an undergraduate level is because that did give you the opportunity to go to medical school. It wasn't like you graduated, went through this program, and then had 4 years of medical school and residency after that. This, at the undergraduate level, you could then apply to medical school, which pretty much all of us did. Of my class, I think half of them went on to medical school. I was not accepted. I did apply, and I was not accepted. And it proved to be probably the best thing for me. So that's kind of what the philosophy was, that even if you didn't function as an AA, you could go to medical school and then maybe become an anesthesiologist and enter the profession that way, which a number of my fellow graduates did become anesthesiologists.
I didn't realize that they purposely designed it so that you could still go to medical school. I guess I never. Well, you tell me, like in the very beginning, when you graduated as an AA, were there jobs there? Like, how, if this was an entirely new thing and entirely new in the Cleveland, Ohio area, what was it like to work as an AA and get that first job?
Well, because of the small number of graduates, we only had 10 or 12, I think. And again, half of them went to medical school. So there were only a half dozen or so AAs going into the job market, and they were absorbed all locally, all just hospitals that we had rotated in. I did a rotation through St. Vincent Charity Hospital in Cleveland, and they offered me a job there. And so we were all absorbed within the Cleveland area, and Emory's students, being in Atlanta, were absorbed mostly into the Atlanta area. And because of the small numbers, we didn't extend out of that area for quite a few years.
Mm-hmm. And so when you started working as an AA, what did you think the trajectory of your career would be like? You know, you didn't get into medical school and maybe that was always the end goal. Were you like, okay, well, I can be an AA for the rest of my life, or I'll probably have to do something later? Like, what was the culture around being an AA?
Well, shortly after I graduated, I did meet your mother, and the course of my life veered off on a severe angle towards that. But I still had a desire to maybe give medical school a try a second time. And after I left the Cleveland area and I moved to Seattle, and then your mom and I were married, and she came out there with me. I felt that, maybe I should give medical school a try again. And so I applied to the University of Washington after doing a little bit more graduate work, just kind of get some credence there. And I applied there, and I got a call, and I got an interview, and then during the interview, the interviewer, who was the dean of the school, kind of said, you're in. Not really formally, but he left very little to the imagination. He said, getting an acceptance letter. So I went to work the next day, and one of my best friends there, who was an anesthesiology resident, told him about it, and he looked at me kind of with a puzzled look and said, why don't you and your wife come over for dinner tonight? So we went over and sat there with his wife and Mary, your mom, and I, and kind of discussed the whole concept of medical school, the stress it was going to have had on his marriage, the stress it would have had on my marriage, our marriage. And after it was all said and done, the next day I called and withdrew my application and decided that I was happy with what I was doing. And that was 40-some years ago.
Dan, this is Jim. I'd like to congratulate you on your upcoming retirement. We've been friends for a long time. We were in both our weddings, many good times together fishing. And, I was thinking about past experiences. I remember you remember Marcy, the x-ray technician. Her boyfriend came in and had a cysto, and I put him to sleep, and he ended up with pulmonary edema. And you made the comment to me that you said, gee, Jim, it took Marcia 30 years to find a boyfriend and you try to knock him off. I'll never forget that one. But what can I say? I could go into separate things, but we worked together, we played together, we enjoyed each other's company. God bless you and Mary.
This next memory is from Michael Havenier. He was a case grad of 1982, and he met Dan in 1981 when he was his Case Cleveland clinical instructor, and they later worked together through 1999 as CAA colleagues. This one is read by Dan's granddaughter, Tempe.
It was always amazing to watch Dan with those huge hands as he would tenderly handle infants and children while placing a caudal epidural. Congratulations and best wishes to you.
This is Julie Banderas. Dan, I met you around 2011. You came to UMKC as a consultant and very quickly became the backbone of our curriculum. You have positively influenced the lives and careers of many. Thank you for the years and expertise you have dedicated to our students and the profession. We especially appreciate your unwavering support, loyalty, and of course, your faithful sense of humor. You will be missed, but please enjoy your retirement. It is well deserved.
This next memory is from Dr. Marge Sedensky. She is a self-described older-than-dirt anesthesiologist who met Dan in 1982 or so as they worked alongside each other at University Hospitals of Cleveland for many years. This message is read by Dan's grandchild, Elias.
I wish I had a picture of Dan holding Mary Jean on his giant palm when she was barely able to stand, and then tossing her way up in the air, scaring the bejesus out of me. Baby Mary laughing away. In the OR, I always felt like giving a prayer of thanks when Dan was assigned to work with me. I knew the case would go perfectly. He was the guy I picked to take care of me when I was a patient. No one could extenuate an arm for a carpal tunnel like Dan. But there are good clinicians who are also jerks. Dan was the best in every facet of his life. Kind, funny, well, hilarious. No BS. So many great memories of Dan.
So I want to hear more about your first few jobs and what it was like to get those early jobs, but I want to go back just a little bit. And I know that you educated CAAs throughout your career in Ohio and in Missouri. And I just wanted to hear you speak on what it was like to be an AA student in the second class versus an AA student now. Like, how was the experience? Maybe the same or different?
Well, the experience as far as being a student is probably very similar. The amount of knowledge that has to be absorbed is significantly more. I think that anesthesia in 1972, when I started, was really not much different than anesthesia during the Civil War. I know that might sound a little crazy, but as a student, when I rotated through one hospital in Cleveland, we did open drop ether and cyclopropane, which were basically the only, and chloroform even, were the anesthetic of choice during the Civil War. They were still being used. There were, of course, more modern agents and things like that, but the techniques were very similar. Now that is ancient history, but in 1972 it was not. And so I did a number of cases with ether, open drop ether. There was one surgeon who was he was in his late 70s, early 80s, and he was an ENT surgeon, still did tonsillectomies, and he refused to allow his patients to get anything but open drop ether because that's the way they did it when he was a resident all through his career. And that's what we did for that man. And I was surprised that the patient lived because it seemed so barbaric. But that's the way it was then.
Surgeons have not changed too much.
No.
They like it the way they like it. Can you walk us through, because you're likely one of the last few people that, most listeners of this podcast would ever hear that have given open drop ether. Like, what was that? Walk us through just the anesthetic. Like, how did that even occur?
Well, okay. There were essentially no monitors. We didn't have any heart monitor or breathing monitors. Basically, our monitors were looking at the patient and seeing if they were breathing, if they had turned blue, a finger on their pulse to see if they had a heartbeat. And I know that sounds like, oh, this guy's just making this up. But the reality is that's the way it was in the early 70s, except in the major medical centers. You would then take the ether and you would drip it onto a mask, and the ether would vaporize just like you smell hairspray or anything.
Mm-hmm.
And they would breathe that in and they would go off to sleep. Now, unfortunately, there was what's called an excitement period. That's kind of like when you're drifting off to sleep and suddenly you jerk in the chair, and you kind of wake up.
Mm-hmm.
And the patients would do that. And sometimes if they were, 180 pounds and 6'4", and they started to get excited and start jumping around, it would take 4 and 5 people to hold them down until they worked through that. And then they would lay still. So that was always an adventure.
Yeah. Wow. Interesting. And when you were doing your rotations, I assume it was rotation style, kind of how it is now. Were you working with anesthesiologists? Were there CRNAs that were teaching? Like, what was that dynamic?
Yeah, mostly it was anesthesiologists. There were, of course, no other AAs, being in the second class. When I first graduated, then they started giving me students right away. But I worked just with anesthesiologists. There was no crossover between CRNAs and AAs in their training. So we didn't really work with CRNAs. They were there working, but we just weren't with them.
And did they use a AA? Like, was the idea of an AA to be a counterpart to a CRNA in terms of like your job description? Like, as we had said earlier, the program was a little bit developed to be a stepping stone to medical school, or you could stay as an AA. Like, what was that professional dynamic when you got out and graduated?
Yes, it was the same job description. And just as it is now, the only real difference between AAs and CRNAs is that CRNAs are licensed such that they can practice independently, where there are no other anesthesia providers, and they can administer anesthesia under the direction of the surgeon. We administer anesthesia under the direction of the anesthesiologist. So a CRNA does not have to have an anesthesiologist involved in the practice, whereas we do.
Mm-hmm. So they used, it sounds like, the roadmap of maybe anesthesiology residency, and then obviously they knew what a CRNA does to kind of build this program. Does that sound about your experience?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, so let's, I want to hear about some of your first jobs. I think I know some of these details, but I think it's interesting to just hear how a new CAA got that first job. Like, what did that look like? You said most people stayed locally, but maybe walk us through maybe the first 2 jobs you had, or how you heard about them, how you got them.
Okay. Well, the first job I had was in Cleveland at St. Vincent Charity Hospital, and I had not rotated there. I remember rotating there a couple days. It was just like a shadowing type situation. And I had narrowed it down between St. Vincent Charity and Metro Hospital in Cleveland. And I basically went with the money. Metro had offered us $11,500 a year, and Charity offered me $12,000. And being a money grubber, I decided I wanted that $12,000. So that's where I went. And at the time, I was making about 25% more than my dad as a city manager in just outside of Cleveland. So it was a pretty good salary considering it was 1974. I went out and immediately bought a brand new car and just had a great time.
For reference, how much do you think an anesthesiologist was making at that time? Like double that, or?
Well, that's way more than double. That's kind of an interesting. There were a number of practices within Cleveland, and I'm sure throughout the country, where an anesthesiologist, there would be one anesthesiologist or maybe 2 on staff, and they may have 12 or 15 CRNAs working with them. And they would essentially sit in the office, and I say that maybe tongue-in-cheek a little bit. They were involved, but they were not able to supervise 12 people themselves. And they were billing for every one of those. So I know that when I interviewed at one hospital in Cleveland, in addition to the Metro and St. Vincent, I met with the CRNA that was involved, and he was telling me about basically the way the anesthesiologist was billing for all these cases and making an astronomical amount of money. That has obviously ended. That is no longer the case. But that was kind of how it was back then.
Mm-hmm. I think it's, sort of sad and also a harsh reality that, a lot of medicine is still about money. I mean, it is a business. And, some of our history as AAs was that we were created by anesthesiologists to be an extension, like an extender. And, who knows exactly why? I mean, maybe you could say why they created us, but perhaps one of the reasons we were created was to, create more opportunity as a money-making venture. I just think if we're going to be honest about what we are as AAs, I think we need to accept the good and the bad and the ugly.
Well, actually, I think that just the opposite was true. Because from the very beginning, we were tied to the idea of 4-to-1.
Oh, really?
So that there was one anesthesiologist who would be supervising no more than 4 people. The anesthesiologists, at least at Case and Emory, recognized the fact that the system was being abused, and that went in very early into our regulations that you could not have more than 4 AAs being supervised by one anesthesiologist. They felt that that was a doable ratio. So in actuality, we kind of were our career was placed in motion with the idea of stopping some of that. Because that still, was a problem when I was a student. And then when I was practicing for years, there were these, we called them, there were these practices where they had just one anesthesiologist and a herd of CRNAs.
Well, then that makes me feel good about us, I guess. I was kind of ready to accept some ugly truth of us, but I'm glad you clarified that, because that, that makes sense that we were always part of this 4-to-1 ratio. But, I think some of the jaded part of me now is maybe thinking maybe this profession was used more as like a pawn for money. But either way, I think something was created that became a very, very good thing. And it's just interesting to hear at that beginning how much everyone understood about that, or how much you understood about that. And when you went to work, did you have this sense of like, wow, I'm a part of something that's just beginning and it's going to be this bigger thing? Or was it just like, this is the degree I got and we'll see where it takes me?
Yeah, pretty much that was the We really didn't know what the future was going to bring. There was no real licensure for us at that point on a national level. So we stepped in this pretty much blind. We didn't know where we would be 10 years later, 20 years later, had no clue.
Interesting.
Hi there, my name is Charlie Chase. I was a UMKC grad in the year 2022. I met Dan in 2020, the illustrious COVID year. So I was a first year during all of that pandemonium. And I guess before the pandemic shut everything down, I suppose I was already getting an idea that Dan had been at this for a while because he had a wealth of stories. And I always liked hearing them. One that definitely particularly stood out to me of just like some of the things that can happen to us in anesthesia is that he was helping get a tube into somebody, and this guy had drank apparently way too much beer, and Dan just got a face full of beer from this guy. I will probably never forget that, and I sometimes think about it when I'm doing an RSI. So Dan pretty much always came to class or to sim lab with a positive attitude. He always had something to say. He's always had something to teach. I don't really ever think I saw him in a bad mood, even when he was sick or not feeling well. So Thanks, Dan. You had a great career. Hope I can take your old spot in Seattle someday. Have a good one.
This next message is from Ben Yoder, who was a Case Cleveland grad from 2002. He met Dan in 2000 as Dan was his Case Cleveland clinical instructor.
I feel an incredible sense of gratitude to Dan for teaching me so many great anesthesia lessons, specifically pediatric anesthesia. However, Dan's lessons in storytelling far exceed one niche area of practice or life. I will never forget trying to keep up in a busy pediatric room while Dan was on the computer across the room trying to close the deal on an eBay auction. Thank you, Dan, for letting the leash out, taking off the arm floaties, removing the training wheels, and really creating an environment for my skills to develop. You are a legend.
This next message is from Asmir Selimovic, who graduated from UMKC MSA program in 2016. He met Dan in 2014 at the start of his program, as Dan was his UMKC faculty. This message is read by Dan's grandson, Matram.
I'll never forget my first day in the OR with Dan. I was still fresh in the program and very green clinically. We were scheduled for a day of cysto cases. He came in, asked me if I had seen the patient and if I was ready for the first case. And then he just left, leaving me with a cold sweat. For the rest of the day, he sat back in a chair and watched me struggle. And boy, was it a struggle. But I made it through. Looking back, it was one of the single most important days of my career. It was a day that renewed a level of confidence at a time when I was really struggling and questioning if I had what it takes. For that, I am forever thankful. Dan, thank you for all the stories, the wisdom, and dedication to the profession. I am honored that I got to work with you and learn from you. I promise to carry on that torch. I wish you and your family all the best. Enjoy your well-deserved retirement. With much gratitude, Asmir Selimovic.
Hi, Dan. It's Eric Johnson from the PA program. Thank you for everything you've done for the AA program and for the School of Medicine and UMKC. I hope you enjoy your retirement. Have a great one. Bye.
I was just going to ask you, what's the biggest risk you ever took in your career? It sounds like becoming an AA in the first place was maybe a risk that you didn't know you were taking that ended up working out. But is there any other risk that you can point to in your career and then just share maybe how that risk turned out?
Well, I guess moving myself and then eventually my new wife clear across the country to Seattle and, making a life out there was a big risk. It's leaving your family and friends and all that, not knowing anyone. That was pretty difficult.
Was there an AA job out there that was advertised, or they contacted you, or? Yeah,
they contacted me, or they contacted our program director, and she knew that I was looking to maybe, get out of the area and go somewhere. And she called me and said, they have a job in Seattle. And I remember she called me at 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock in the morning before I went in the operating room. And I immediately called Seattle, not really realizing that it was 3 hours early and I was calling them at 5 a.m. No one will be there for about 4 more hours. I said, okay, I'll call back. And then my mother and I flew out there, and I interviewed, got the job, came back, resigned, and then in the very early month, I think it was February of 76, moved out there by myself.
Mm. So that was a good risk that turned out, you think?
Yes, I think so. I don't think, though, my life would be much different if I hadn't gone out there. It was nice to, see other part of the country, and I was able to learn regional anesthesia out there, which I had never experienced before, and that's giving spinals and epidurals and those kinds of things. And when I ultimately did come back to Cleveland, I was kind of looked at as the expert in regional anesthesia, and actually was requested on several occasions to come in and do regional anesthesia that I had learned in Seattle, and they didn't really do very much of in Cleveland. So in that respect, it it expanded my abilities, my education.
What would you say when you're looking back was the best thing about being a CAA?
Well, I think your childhood and your sister and your brother is probably the number one thing. I, as a young father with 2 or 3 young children, was able to spend an inordinate amount of time with you. And quick story, I remember I was talking to Mom one day and I said, she said, do you have to work tomorrow? I said, yeah, tomorrow's my 24-hour day. I was working a 24-hour shift and then a 16-hour shift. And then I was off for 5 days. And you were about 6 years old and you looked up to me and you said, Daddy, do you work? You had no clue I even had a job. Because when I went off to work, you went with Mom, you went, shopping and to the playground and stuff. And you got home, you went to bed. The next morning I was there again for 3 days. So that to me was a wonderful experience that I wouldn't have gotten in a 9-to-5 job in an office, things like that.
Any comments about the number of years that you've been a CAA and all the changes? Like, is there any sort of overarching comment about all the things you've seen and how it's changed? You saw the entire progression of our profession.
Yeah, absolutely. There were some major milestones in my profession that I saw. As I mentioned to you, when I was a student, I was using drop ether. I was using techniques that were literally utilized in the Civil War, 1865. I was doing those same techniques with very little modification. Then science finally caught up, and it's probably because of the space race. If you've seen the movie Apollo 13, they have a heart monitor on, which they are monitoring remotely on Earth, and they pull their monitors off and they think their heart stopped, and it was a very critical period. We did not have monitors like that routinely until the late 70s, early 80s. And then we got those monitors. We then got, again, from the space, from NASA, we got oxygen monitors. So we knew how much oxygen was in the blood. We got end-tidal carbon dioxide monitors so we could see how well people were breathing. And historically, up to that point, death secondary to anesthesia was about 1 in 20,000. So if you had any given day, you had 20,000 anesthetics going on, somebody was going to die. And that was it. We used to say they took a bad anesthetic, that they had a reaction, it wasn't picked up, and they died. Once the pulse oximeter and the capnograph, the CO2 monitor and the oxygen monitor were introduced, that number went from 1 in 20,000 to 1 in 200,000. It was a 10-fold improvement in outcome simply from those 2 monitors. And in fact, when we first started using those monitors, especially the oxygen monitor, that a lot of people wouldn't believe that people had so little oxygen. And we actually had to change the way we breathe for people to give them more, because all these patients were being starved of oxygen under the old system. Kind of interesting.
In my career, I remember something somewhat similar when Sugamidex was coming out. I graduated CAA school in 2008, and it was just in like the European trial phase, and it was coming, and we had some journal clubs about it. And then it came to my practice probably 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago. So in like 2016-ish maybe. And that's a really long time to kind of work up to something or to know something's possibly coming. Was that what it was like when the capnograph was coming and then the pulse ox was coming? Or did they just show up one day and people just adopted them easily? Or what was that like?
Well, initially, both those monitors were the size of televisions.
Oh.
They were enormous because they had They had limited microcircuitry. And so they were very large and cumbersome. They needed significant amount of maintenance. But once they miniaturized them, then basically they caught on like wildfire, because it became obvious for us that this was a significant improvement in our ability to anesthetize people and keep them healthy or keep them safe. So it really went quick.
What was it like when LMAs come out? I feel like that was kind of more in my recent, I feel like that happened in the 80s, right?
Yeah, the laryngeal mask airway, which is kind of an airway that fits down the throat for anyone who doesn't know what that is. It was an instrument that really did help us revolutionize the airway maintenance. Up until then, you had two ways to maintain an airway. One was to put in a breathing tube, which we still do, and the other was to just put a mask on the face, like a CPAP mask that you see advertised on television. And then you would hold the mask there, and they would breathe, and you were always kind of tied to that mask. You could use some straps, but you were holding that mask all the time. It didn't really open the airway up very much. You sometimes had to put other things in there to open the airway up. So it kind of tied your hands up to the patient. And that didn't allow you then to utilize your hands for things like mixing up drugs and that kind of stuff. It just became a little cumbersome. Once the LMA went in and that opened up the airway, it just sat in the back of the throat, that really did relieve you of a lot of maintenance that you had to have to the airway. The problem, of course, is that it did not protect your airway. In other words, if you were to vomit under anesthesia, which occasionally happens, they're going to breathe that right into their lungs, whereas a breathing tube, that's not going to happen. So I think initially we thought, well, maybe we could use it more than we do. But now I think we know our restrictions and patients are safer for it.
It would have been interesting to be a fly on the wall when you guys are having your little lunches. That was the good old days when reps brought lunches every single day and all this new equipment was coming out. Very interesting.
Hi, this is Shane Angus. I was in the class of 1999 in Case Western Reserve in Cleveland. I first met Dan in 1997 as a first-year student, and I fondly remember how much independence he gave us early on in our training, and also knowing full well that no matter what we did, he was able to jump in and solve any issues that might take place. His independence would be quite noticed in that he would sometimes be across the room, but we knew that he'd be able to jump in and rescue us if needed. Importantly, one of those rescues took place in my second year wrapping up my peds rotation. I was walking by his room, and it was a late add-on case for a tumor resection, supraglottic. And unbeknownst to us, the tumor was farther along than anticipated. And he said, "Hey, you want to do this intubation real quick? It'll be interesting." Little did I know how interesting it would be. This ended up being a failed to intubate, failed to mask ventilate case that he and several people tried to intubate. But of course, at the end of the day, Dan saved the day and saved me from quite a bit of fear in having cases like that in the future. So Dan, thank you so much for the trust you gave us, and thank you so much for your dedication to your patients and to our profession. We'll miss you.
This is Laura Begley. Dan, we probably met in 2010 or 11, working together at the UMKC AA program. You came in when you hadn't joined us full time, but were joining us as a contract employee to help train our students in the first few weeks of the program to get them prepared, and became a full-time faculty member with us. I just want to thank you for the years of dedication that you've given to our students and to the AA profession. A career like yours deserves a much restful retirement. So best of luck to you in your next phase of life. I hope it includes a lot of times with Mary, lots of cruises, times with the kids and grandkids. You deserve it.
This next message is from Ty Townsend. He is a Case Cleveland grad from 2001. He met Dan as a first-year student in 1999, as Dan was his Case Cleveland clinical instructor. And later they worked together at UMKC as faculty colleagues. This message is read by Dan's grandson, Xavier.
Dan is a legend in the AA community. He interacted with every case student for decades during their pediatric rotation. His big hands had the soft touch with the smallest of babies, and I will always appreciate learning to mask and start an IV at the same time. I had the privilege of calling him my colleague at UMKC, where he helped to guide the development of an evolving program in Kansas City. Dan has given back so much to the profession, and I am deeply honored to have spent the last 20 years working with him.
Dan, this is Troy Green. I met you back in 2019 at UMKC. I'm now working at Liberty Hospital, and I wouldn't be there if it weren't for you. So congratulations on retirement. You're the man. We all loved you, and you're a great person. Have a great family. I hope you enjoy every moment of it. Take care, Dan.
This next message is from Dr. Phil Morgan, who graduated from the University of Colorado in 1980. He met Dan in 1982 as an anesthesia resident and worked together as a young anesthesia faculty for many years after.
As a young faculty, I learned as much from Dan as any faculty mentor I've ever had. I loved working with him because it helped me grow as an anesthesiologist. I had a better working relationship with Dan than any other individual in the OR. A gentle giant, unpresumptuous, dedicated to his patients, and kind to all. I have always worked to emulate his style in the operating room. Thanks, Dan. Your friend, Phil.
I am just thinking about you in like your 30s that I am now and your 40s. And I'm kind of curious if you ever thought about the duration of your career as you like approach the end of your career now. Like, did you ever think about retirement? What were you thinking retirement would be, or where did you see your career going?
Well, I spent 23 years at University Hospitals of Cleveland, and I enjoyed that immensely. I did a lot of pediatrics, a lot of OB. So I did some things that I wouldn't have maybe experienced in just a general hospital somewhere. But I had always wanted to eventually get out of the Cleveland area and get to maybe a more rural, small town area. And when you kids were in school and that, you were doing very well, and I didn't want to interrupt that. But once Ryan, your younger brother, got to be in high school and this whole thing came up, he said, Dad, we can leave if you want to. I'm perfectly happy with moving. So that's when I looked at Springfield, Ohio, small town, small city. And I would have joined one of my former students there who was already working there. Very nice group, little less stress maybe, though that was my interpretation. It proved it wasn't any less. But someplace where I thought we could, maybe retire. So went down there when I was, 50 years old or so, and was there for 10 years till I was about 60. And then the opportunity to teach came up. Two of my former students were running a program here in Kansas City and contacted me, and one thing led to another, and we moved out here. And I worked part-time in clinically and essentially full-time at the university. Mm-hmm. And that's been now for the last 11, 12 years.
Yeah, so I had moved out to Kansas City to be a part of that school when I graduated Case Cleveland in 2008. And I had been working here in Kansas City for, I think, a couple years before they approached you to begin doing like the early boot camp for the UMKC MSA program. So you would come out here for a couple months. I think you did that for a couple years, right? Where you came out, stayed in a hotel for a month and a half, taught this boot camp, took vacation from your Springfield, Ohio job, and then went back to Springfield. And kind of over that couple years, they finally talked you into it and gave you a good enough offer that you left what you thought was going to be your retirement house and job and moved out here to Kansas City. And then also interesting fact is that Ryan, my brother who was just mentioned, he was in the Army. And when he left the Army, he ended up getting his prereqs and going back to anesthesia school at the very school where my dad came to teach. So now my little brother graduated as an AA in 2018. I'm an AA and my dad is an AA. So you've got a few generations there that have followed your footsteps.
Yeah.
Which I think says a lot. And so I want to ask you, if there are any regrets or do-overs with your career, is there anything where you wish had gone differently, or do you wish you maybe went to medical school? Or
Well, when things were rough professionally, and those would be, for instance, and I don't know if you've shared this with your listeners, but there was a time when we were not included in federal regulations, and for a short period of time. And when that happened, basically I had to go cut firewood for my dad in order to pay the bills.
can you say more on that? Because I'm still unclear exactly what that meant. Like, now that I'm a CAA, I feel like I can understand that story better.
Well, back in the early 80s, I guess unbeknownst to our profession, or, the movers and shakers at the time, the federal government rewrote the Medicare and Medicaid laws. And basically within those regulations, they would specify who would get reimbursed for anesthesia care or any kind of medical care. And they listed anesthesiologists, certified registered nurse anesthetists, but for some reason did not include, which we had been in there before, anesthesiologist assistants. Now, I maintain that I don't think it was an inadvertent overlook. I have a feeling that behind the scenes there was some manipulation and we were out of the regs. Well, those regs were passed, and now any anesthesia given by an anesthesiologist assistant could not be reimbursed by the federal government. And that meant, at least at university hospitals, I was there at the time, I think it was, that meant millions of dollars that could not be billed. Well, they would not let us practice anymore until they got that fixed.
Like, the HR of the hospital said you can't practice anymore because we can't reimburse you, or can't get reimbursed for you.
Right.
Okay.
So we did not do anesthesia, but I must give kudos to the university. They continued paying us. And it was a short period of time, but it really did show us that we had to be much more politically active. We had to know what was going on behind the scenes so we could head those off. And our national organization, the Quad A, AAAA, became much more politically active. And we have not had problems since then. In fact, the Quad A uses their political clout to open up more states. That's something also we should probably discuss a little bit. The way this opened up, the first two states that got people, that where we were able to practice were Ohio and Georgia, because that's where we were trained. Well, the first person that wanted to go to Louisiana, for instance, had to go to the state legislator, had to find a sponsor, a physician sponsor. They had to then introduce legislation. They had to create a slot for them to fit in, and then deal with the medical billing for the insurance companies in that state. So it was a lengthy process. And it didn't happen. It still hasn't happened in all 50 states because there really aren't a lot of people that necessarily want to go to Wyoming to work, or someplace like that.
Well, and there's only 3,000 AAs or something. I think there's 3,200 maybe-ish. And you divide that out between all of the people or all of the states, and then, multiply how much it costs to open a state, because it costs money to pass a bill. We just don't have the momentum or the push behind us unless we get help from the anesthesiologist. But so yeah, it's been a slow process. And yeah, I think it is just one of those hard truths of our profession that we've been slow to grow. And I think our naysayers can say that's because of one set of reasons. And then when you're inside the profession, you see it sort of differently, and that it's not because we're not qualified, but maybe it's because it costs money to fight our opposition, the CRNAs, on a legislative battle, not necessarily on a personal battle. And, there's only 3,000 of us. I think there's maybe 60,000 CRNAs or something, somewhere in that, multiplications more of us. But yeah, I think it's one of those professions that when you find it and it fits with you, it really resonates. And I also think it's not for everyone. So it's good if you're looking into the CAA profession to kind of know its limitations and also what it does offer, what it could offer. And that's one of the things that this podcast really is for, is that for people who are CAAs and people who maybe are a CAA student or want to become a CAA, I think it's to highlight what I call the power of our profession to live a life by design rather than default, which I think is, maybe a loaded statement. And I just wonder, Dad, if you feel like the profession did that for you in your life. Like, do you feel like it allowed you to live the life you wanted as opposed to, having to fall in line and do things a certain way? Or
Well, I do think it did allow me to have the life I wanted. I have, any number of friends that are anesthesiologists, were anesthesia residents, and I know that a lot of them have regrets. I've had any number of them say that if there had been the opportunity to become an AA when they were looking at medical school, they would have become an AA. They would not have gone to medical school. It's a tough road, medical school. Obviously, it's 4 years of your 4 years of undergraduate, 4 years of medical school, 4 years of residency. So you're 8 additional years after graduation from college that you are somewhat putting your personal life on hold. So from that standpoint, I think it was a wonderful choice. And again, I've had a number of anesthesiologists who have told me if it was available when they were training, if they had known about it, they would have gone that direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is one of the most powerful things about our profession is that you can get in at a young enough age that you're kind of starting on this leg up, just in terms of, all the personal sacrifices that, you do have to make in the school, but that's a much smaller period of time. And then you come out and maybe you do have some student debt, but you're making enough income that you can pay off the student debt. So you're not tied down by that debt for as long as lots of other professions. You walk out into a career where you feel worthy and respected and you feel good about what you're doing. You're helping people. Like, it just really satisfies a lot of those innate human needs so early on that I feel like you can have then more space and time in your life to build the other things that you're interested in, the other parts of yourself alongside your anesthesia career, or you can have just this big, beautiful anesthesia career and, realize that that's what you want. So I do think there's just so much good to it that I've found. And I kind of stumbled into the profession, even though I had you as my dad. I never really thought, oh, I'm going to be a CAA. I thought too, oh, I'm going to go to medical school. And so many people, even you, who was in the second class ever, kind of had that start into it where it was almost like the thing you did when you didn't get into medical school or you didn't, you veered off the medical school path. I just find that very interesting that we all kind of have a similar story, or a lot of us do. And then it ends up being this beautiful, wonderful career that you kind of tripped into. So I don't know what exactly that was all to say, except for sometimes I think life takes you in a way that, it's supposed to go, whether you're leading it or not. I did just have a question just for myself. If you ever thought about what retirement would look like and how, now that you're 2 months away from retirement, in reality retirement is looking, and what's the difference between the two?
Well, when you're 25 years old and you look at 40 years to retirement, I thought at 65 I would be done. And I think had I been just involved in clinical anesthesia, because of the stress involved, and it is a very stressful job. Occasionally someone's trying to die right in front of you. And, it's a lot of responsibility. And I think had I not gotten into the academics, that I think I might have burned out a little quicker. I'm still not burned out. I still feel I can contribute. But 70 is kind of old.
So you are 70, everyone, and he's retiring in 2 months.
Yes.
And you're almost 71. You're closer to 71 than you are 70.
Yes, that's true. That's true. So I was going to go back, though, and talk about the finances a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
so many physicians, when you talk to them, they talk about the crushing financial burden that they have from medical school, the huge debt. When I graduated, and again, it was at the undergraduate level, but I had student loans that I had to pay off, and it was crushing because it cost me $25.90 a month. Now, I know when you graduated, you had some
I had $160,000 from undergraduate and graduate.
If you don't mind telling people, how long did it take you to pay off the majority of that? Do you remember?
It took, I had initially said 5 years, and then I got married and bought a house, and so it ended up taking me just shy of 10 years.
Yeah. So about my $35.90 for 10 years was your $160 for 10 years. Mm-hmm. And I'm assuming you didn't find it as a huge burden.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, it was definitely a goal. I switched our budget and to be able to pay off a 20-year loan in 10 years. And I didn't have to do that, I guess, but it was something that I knew I could do. And it didn't have to sacrifice all the other aspects of my life just to pay off my student loans. Like I still got to live a great life and pay for my own wedding mostly and, all that.
Yeah, I paid a little bit.
You did pay a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I always recommend to students is that once you graduate and you start your job, continue to live like a student for as long as you can, whether it's a year or two, and take that extra money that you would have bought a brand new car with and a house with and gone to, on a big vacation and pay off your loans, get rid of that, at least the high interest loans. And I still think that's probably a good idea. I know you paid off your high interest loans up front as much as you could.
Yes.
And, but we had that luxury because we're making a salary that's very handsome.
Mm-hmm. Do you mind sharing what your beginning salary was $12,000? Can you share? Do you mind sharing what your ending salary was after 48 years? I kind of know, and so I think it's interesting.
Yeah. Well, $12,500 in 1974. When I was, and I will tell you that I stepped back slightly when I came here because academia doesn't pay quite as well as private practice. But when I left Springfield, Ohio in
2009, probably, which was your last clinical job, your full clinical job, just to be clear.
It was about 200. I made about 200 that year.
200,000 when you were working all clinical.
All clinical. And that included overtime and things like that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I just think that's like a staggering, that's a whole nother podcast just to understand how a salary could go from 12,000 to 200,000. But then again, I look at my starting salary versus my salary now, or my hourly, let's call it, which might be more of a better comparison because I'm only working 2 days, but that has also continued to go up. So it is a profession that has been and always will be, it seems, well compensated in terms of well respected, I guess. And, in our culture, money is some form of respect. You're receiving that for the energy you put forth.
Right.
Congratulations, Dan. This is Jenny Nolan. I graduated in 2018 and just wanted to share a quick story. Dan's son, Ryan, was in my class. And so obviously Ryan referred to Dan as Dad, but because Dan is so close to Dad, oftentimes myself and my classmates would also refer to Dan as Dad accidentally. So Dan truly is such a paternal figure and certainly is the reason I am the provider, but more importantly, the person I am today. So congratulations, Dan, on a very wonderful, purpose-filled career. I wish you nothing but joy and relaxation and people knowing your name and not being called Hey Anesthesia from here on out.
This next message is from Meg McHugh, who graduated from UMKC Anesthesia Program in 2013. She met Dan when they both started for the first year at UMKC in 2010. This message is read by Elias.
Dan, I remember you always. You just arrived to UMKC and so did we. My class was your first year and you attended all of our classes with us. You, Melanie, and Lance ran out boot camp. I felt like we really had someone in our corner. Thank you for all you have done for us and our career.
This message is from Pete Kalusik, who graduated from Case Cleveland in 1975. He met Dan in 1972 when they were first teammates on the Case football and track teams, and then they worked together for many years after as CAA colleagues. This one is read again by Matram.
Dan is a great guy. He was gracious enough to let us use his living room for a meeting to discuss forming the northern chapter of the AAAA in the mid-'80s. He was on the Quadruple A Board of Directors and Education and Practice Committee. His professional advocacy by teaching helped our profession get to where it is today. Best wishes to all your future endeavors.
Hi, Dan. This is Jim Wooten, and hopefully you remember me. I've known you since our AA program began at UMKC. You and I have taught together for many years. I've respected you a great deal, your honesty, your integrity, and not only your willingness and your care for the students, but I could also tell how much you care for your patients. So I just want to know I'm going to miss you. You've been great to work with, Dan. As you and I have talked about many years, hopefully within the next few years, I'll be able to join you in retirement. But until then, you enjoy yours. Have a great retirement and enjoy your family. And God bless you, my friend. You deserve this, but know that you will be missed a great deal.
Well, we are nearing our last question. And Dad, you did great. This has been fun.
I know what your question is going to be.
What?
What's for dinner this Sunday?
No.
Does her and the family come over every Sunday for dinner?
Now my dad and I live about 15 minutes away. And then my brother, who's also a CAA, he lives about 45 minutes away. And my brother and I work at the same surgery center outside of Kansas City. So it's one big, happy CAA family. But here is the last question.
Okay.
For any younger person who's listening and maybe years away from retirement, or maybe if you think on your younger self, what is any advice or any words of wisdom that you would give that younger generation or your younger self about the life that you're living now?
Well, I think some things have changed in society since I first started working. Back in the 70s and the 80s, the idea was you would work a job for 35 years or whatever, you'd retire and the company would take care of you. In the 80s or so, late 80s, that changed, and certainly in your lifetime that's changed, that you've got to set up your own retirement. You've got to have your own money, because when you are done, there may not be anything from your employer or a limited amount from your employer. And same with the government. Social Security doesn't give you a whole lot. So I think the number one thing is that don't just live for today. When you are starting to get that big paycheck, boy, that $400,000, $500,000 house sure is pretty. But the $300,000 house will work too. The Mercedes, wow, it's a great car, but so is a Chevy.
Mm-hmm.
And just kind of make those kinds of decisions. Just exercise frugality. Set up a plan where you can save, invest, be prudent with your investments. Don't buy some wacky stock like I did once that it was a nickel stock or a penny stock, and I bought 2,000 shares of it, and it zoomed up from, I think, $1 a share to $2.50 a share, and then fell to zero.
And zoomed down.
That's where it is now. Just be prudent. Yes, 150, 180,000, 200, that's a lot of money, but it goes pretty quick, especially when you get more family responsibilities and your kids need braces and all this kind of stuff. So that's all I guess I would say.
And do you feel like that's something that you could have done better? It sounds like you're telling yourself that.
Yeah, I mean, we tried. I did some investment in real estate. Unfortunately, there was a downturn in the economy when we were trying to sell a house after we had bought another one. And it set us back. But we recovered, and we were a little more frugal, a little smarter about it. And now that I'm approaching retirement, I don't think I'll need to eat cat food at every meal as a retired individual. So, in fact, you guys will start seeing more of us around mealtime, I think.
Yeah, you'll start coming over here.
Yeah.
Awesome, Dad. Well, that's not awesome, you eating cat food, but this conversation has been great. And I do think that there might be some CAAs or CAA students out there who have a few questions or want to hear more from you or hear more about Open Drop Ether and have a question that they're burning to ask. Are you open to people contacting you? And if so, I guess, should they do that?
They can certainly email you through the podcast. I assume you have a way to contact.
Sounds like you're an avid listener, Dad, to this podcast.
Yeah. Well, what's it called again? Anyway, I actually we had to buy a little laptop here in order for me to even do this. So
yes, you're step one.
Exactly. But they can contact you if they want my email address. You can include that on your website. Certainly be more than willing to talk to anybody, give them my bits of wisdom. I will warn you, though, that if you start a conversation with me and we start to reminisce, it could turn into a long conversation. But, feel free to say, I got disconnected and be gone.
Okay, well, I'll put in the show notes that they can email awakened-anesthetist at gmail.com, and I can shoot the messages to you, and you guys can connect that way.
That'll be perfect.
I do want to end this episode with some mindful breathing. This, maybe of your generation, is not something that you have a lot of practice doing, but I do think it is helpful just to show that breathing is something that everyone can do, that it's something that makes us all feel good. It activates our parasympathetic system. And it's really nice to do at the end of something and before you start another thing. I call those mindful transitions. And I talked a little bit about those in previous podcast episodes. And so I'm just trying to make a habit of doing 3 mindful breaths with all of my process episode guests and just experience maybe the awkwardness or it feels different to do something like that. And just do that together as, just like a practice. So I'm going to ask you to take 3 deep breaths with me. I'm not going to count or anything. We can just take big, long inhales and hopefully deeper, longer exhales that really activates your parasympathetic system. And then we'll say goodbye. So here we go. One more breath together. Hold. And exhale. I hope everyone enjoyed this process episode, hearing about the long career of a CAA in the second graduating class out of Case, Cleveland, who also happens to be my dad. I have really enjoyed this episode, and I'm very excited to go back and edit this and release it out to everyone. Dad, thank you for coming. What do you think? Did it go well?
Well, I just want to tell you that I've decided that I'm going to improve my parasympathetic system by suppressing my sympathetics with alcohol. And I'll be very mellow.
Was this a stressful experience for you?
No, not really. Remember, I've been in open hearts with people trying to die in front of me. It wasn't that stressful.
Okay, well, good. Well, you did great for your first podcast experience, and I appreciate you, and I hope to make a good episode that you will be proud of.
Great. Thank you very much.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Wow. Thank you so much for listening all the way through to the end of this episode. I really appreciate you helping me honor my dad in this way. If you contributed to this episode, I am so grateful to be able to share your voice with my dad and our anesthesia community. Truly, I'm hoping this is a way to memorialize his career and is a way for us to remember that we all have a huge impact past just our day-to-day interactions and that what we do truly matters. Dad, I'm so proud of you. I'm so grateful you showed me about this CAA profession. We love you.
Actually,
whatever you want to say.
I like you, Papa.
Want to listen to that?
Yeah. I love you, Grandpa. Congratulations. Okay, bye. It sounds so loud when I talk. Why is that?
Because you're talking to a microphone.
Ooh.
What do you want to do with Grandpa when he doesn't have to go to work as much anymore?
Watching Notre Dame.
Oh.
And the Browns.
What else do you want to do?
Checkers.
Do you want to tell Grandpa anything?
You're the best Grandpa ever.